So I am Dr. Wonder Drake from Vanderbilt University. I've been asked by the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research to discuss grant writing, how to write a successful grant. So I think the plan is I'm going to basically discuss my techniques for helping keep my lab funded, and then my mentees. And in addition, we have Dr. Mary McGowan here, who's the CEO of FSR, and Dr. Ozioma Chioma, who is current, soon-to-be early career faculty member at Vanderbilt University, starting July 1. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mary.
Yes, so thank you so much for that wonderful beginning and introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our series for clinicians and researchers focusing on how to write a successful grant proposal. I'm Mary McGowan, CEO of FSR, and for those of you who may not know, FSR is the leading international nonprofit association committed to accelerating research in sarcoidosis, providing education and support to those living with sarcoidosis and their care partners, and raising awareness about sarcoidosis worldwide. Just want to give a little bit of quick bit of housekeeping. Your phone will be muted. However, we would like to encourage you to ask questions. There's a chat box located at the bottom of your screen. Please type your questions into this box throughout the presentation. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentations, and the webinar will be recorded and can be accessed on our website. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us for this exciting webinar. We launched this webinar series in January of 2021 as a way to provide additional support and guidance for researchers seeking funding in sarcoidosis. Our initial webinar featured Dr. Elliot Krauser, who's the FSR Scientific Advisory Board Chair, and Dr. Erica Herzog, who was the recipient of FSR's grant for disease models, and Dr. Chengwan Ru, FSR Fellow from 2018 to 2020. And it's had already over 100 views. So we know that there's great interest in this program, and you can visit our YouTube site to view that. But FSR was founded over 20 years ago by a woman living with sarcoidosis and her husband. Since that time, FSR has provided over $5 million in support of sarcoidosis research, and we have over 50,000 members in our community. So it's really a four-pronged approach of what we do. First, we work to advance and accelerate research in sarcoidosis. FSR has a robust fellowship and grant program to support researchers in the sarcoidosis space. In addition, through FSR's SarConnect program, FSR works with academic and industry partners to identify willing clinical trial participants and to ensure that all research remains patient-centered. FSR also provides those living with sarcoidosis numerous support opportunities, including wellness programming, social events with others who have similar lived experiences, and even one-to-one support through our Patient Navigator program. Additionally, we are committed to providing educational opportunities for patients and clinicians in order to provide them with the most up-to-date research and clinical care information. And finally, FSR advocates for research and clinicians and those living with sarcoidosis by encouraging more funding for sarcoidosis research and working to reduce access challenges. Next slide. FSR is proud to work with our esteemed scientific advisory board composed of world-renowned key opinion leaders within the field of sarcoidosis, medical research, therapy development, and medical practice. As a reminder, April is Sarcoidosis Awareness Month. Please visit our awareness page at stopsarcoidosis.org/awareness to learn about all of our incredible programming this month. You can download our social media graphics and our social media tool. And join us for everybody's step-in for the weekend, April 23rd and 4th, as we create a final push for our Step-in for Stark Endurance and Fundraising Challenge in support of FSR's research and support programming. We're also going to be hosting a virtual patient summit this year from June 12th through 13th. Please share this information with your patients and encourage them to take part. We'll be announcing more information on our website in the very near future. So it is now my pleasure to introduce FSR's Research Manager, Tamara Al-Hakim, Tamara Al-Hakim, to share a quick overview of FSR's Small Grant Funding Program. Tamara, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mary. As Mary stated, my name is Tamara Al-Hakim. I've been with FSR since 2018, and I've been overseeing and developing the FSR Small Grant since then. I've been, really amazed by all the work that's come out of the Sarcoidosis grant program that we run here at FSR. I've seen some great, grants come through, some great successes. I highly encourage everyone to apply to at least one FSR grant. It's a great practice, even if you're not 100% ready, just to get an idea of how the grants programs work and get feedback for your proposal as well. Next slide, please. So FSR is really excited to share with you this unique funding opportunity in the amount of $25,000 through FSR Small Grants. This small grant aims to support smaller scale or pilot research projects that can be either supported by FSR's funding alone or in conjunction with additional funders. Next slide, please. So proposals are encouraged from investigators across a variety of disciplines. Submitting projects will lead to direct and significant impact upon sarcoidosis research. Dr. Wonder Drake has applied recently and had great success, and she was awarded an FSR Small Grant. So as you can see, doesn't necessarily mean you have to be an early career investigator, or you can be an established KOL with a novel idea and still, apply for funding. Next. So FSR Small Grant is a one-time award for $25,000. When we look at our applications, we look at strength and overall strategy, the methodology and analysis. We encourage proposals from investigators from all types of disciplines, so not strictly pulmonology. You can do bench research, clinical research, translational research, any type of research. And we submit projects that will lead to direct and significant impact. Next slide. So allowable costs, each applicant should include a narrative that explains each of their budget expenses. This is especially important, so we do ask for a budget justification. We allow dedicated salary and fringe benefits, any research equipment that will be used. So if any of the research equipment is taking up 50% of the research budget and goes on longer or can be used longer than the grant period, we would like an explanation or kind of a letter stating how that product will be used after the grant period has ended. Any trial costs can also be allowed. We do not allow any indirect costs. So if you have any subcontracts or any instructors or anyone that you're going to be collaborating with, please be sure to include that information into your application as well. And all co-funding should be identified with the amounts and expenses covered by that co-funding. Next. So we do require for our FSR Small Grant annual progress reports and financial reports that show the spend down of the grant, as well as a final estimated budget and a final report at the end of the year. As you know, all of your application during the progress report should include any of your new literature reviews, any data, and any research that's also relevant to your proposal. So if you're working on something that is, kind of adjacent to your research, but it does apply to your research, also include that too. Next slide. So for our deadlines, we have May 31st is the deadline for all of our applications. We will be reviewing the applications from June 1st to June 30th, and then we will be notifying for a decision on July 1st. The earliest that the institutions will receive that payment will be July 31st. This will be dependent on a few things, contracting, as well as we need IRB either approval submitted to FSR or an IRB, that you've submitted to your IRB, and then we can move forward with providing funding. Next slide. So I'm now honored to introduce Dr. Wanda Drake, who is a professor at medicine and the director of Sarcoidosis Center of Excellence in Division of Infectious Diseases at Vanderbilt, to share some tips and tricks on how to write a successful grant for Fsr Small Grant as well as beyond. Dr. Drake has published over 40 articles in sarcoidosis, pulmonary fibrosis, and the etiology as well as pathogenesis of chronic inflammatory conditions. Dr. Drake is a recipient of Fsr Small Grant for her project entitled, "What is the clinical impact of IL-6 blockade on sarcoidosis pulmonary fibrosis?" This investigation examined the increased production of IL-6 in certain T cells in female sarcoidosis patients compared to males. This proposal also looks at the therapeutic efficiency of IL-6 blockade on sarcoidosis and pulmonary fibrosis. Dr. Drake has also received funding from the NIH and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and is the recipient of multiple ATS Society Awards for excellence in sarcoidosis research. I'll give it to you, Dr. Drake.
She's so cute. Thank you very, very much. So I'm excited to kind of share what I've learned about getting funding in the realm of sarcoidosis research. There are no dumb questions. So if something I say doesn't make sense, please feel free to enter into the chat, and I'm happy to elaborate on what I've found. So this really is a talk, not just for funding for the applying for FSR grants, but generally grants in general. What's a good idea? Where do you find opportunities? What do you do with rejections? Which is something that we all experience. So next slide, please. So I really do feel like it's the responsibility of more senior sarcoid researchers to build the next generation of scientists. All of us are, have undergone the benefit of amazing sarcoidosis researchers, Lee Newman, David Mahler. We've all kind of gone through just some amazing mentoring nationally and internationally. And it's time for us to build the next generation. So next slide, please. One of the things so what I will do first is just kind of elaborate on the components of a successful application and the role that mentoring has in it, and then provide an overview of private and public funding mechanisms that are available for early career faculty members. Next slide, please. So one of the things that society, that everyday person may not realize is that while the United States is doing a solid job of producing clinical doctors, producing independent physician scientists is actually becoming more and more rare. And so we estimate that approximately 18,000 medical students are educated every year, and a little under half of those will go into the discipline more relevant for sarcoidosis, like internal medicine, and then a little over half of those will participate in a fellowship. Once you do fellowship, so this is your training after you've completed residency, you can decide, do I want to be a specialist in the clinical realm, in private practice, kind of seeing patients every day, taking care of them, making life better one patient at a time, or do I actually want to do a fellowship and actually work in an academic medical center where I spend more time in research, but I also continue to see patients. And institutions such as Vanderbilt, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, these institutions have numerous mechanisms to build your career with the goal of helping you to become an independent scientist. So they frequently, just previous slide, please. It begins with you getting funding on a T32 or applying for your own funding through an F30 or 30 or 32 mechanism. Once you do, that's what to support postdoctoral fellowship. You then can apply for a K award, which is usually 4 to 5 years of funding, depending on the institute, where they'll pay your salary plus give you research dollars. Often at this stage, this is where you get your first faculty job with your K award. You can go to a state, some people stay at the institution where they've trained, others will go to a different institution where you get a startup package. This is when you start your lab, you start hiring your teams, and you're producing publications where you're the senior author. Hopefully within So the goal is to transition from a K award, which equals out to approximately $500,000, to an RO1, which is about $1.25 million. So once you get your RO1, there's more funding, so you're able to do more in-depth science, you're able to think about things in a more in-depth way. You've got protected time to really focus on building your research program. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of decisions, factors that influence whether someone wants to go into a career as a clinician, where you're seeing patients maybe in private practice, or maybe at like a Vanderbilt, or maybe you have a PhD and you're deciding, do I want to go into industry and work in industry, or do I want to be a teacher at an academic medical center, or an academic center, teacher at a small college, where I teach science to the next generation, or do I want to actually have an independent lab program that I run? A lot of the heavy influences are just curious about disease. That's what happened to me. I just saw patients with sarcoidosis and was kind of amazed at the lack of therapeutic options. And I thought, golly, I want to intervene. I want to make a difference. I had amazing role models all throughout my graduate school education of physician scientists and basic scientists, clinician scientists, clinical scientists who do clinical trials, and then the research. So fortunately, I had a project in my postdoctoral fellowship that was successful. It translated to a paper pretty quickly. And with that translation to a paper, I was able to successfully get my Career Development Award from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So if you're a medical student or a resident who's thinking about research, I would strongly consider, when you're doing your postdoctoral fellowship, speaking with your mentor and saying, do we think that this work will get published in a reasonable amount of time? And 2 years is reasonable, 3 years is reasonable. You want to ideally, in your postdoctoral fellowship, certainly by the second year, have at least one first topic paper, even if it's just a review article, as a way to establish yourself in the field, and then have other papers coming. I think people, I'm not sure job security is the reason people decide to run their own lab, because it's pretty dependent upon you maintaining your funding. Anticipated salary, so kind of depends. One of the things my mentor told me is, if you want a competitive salary, you need to get grants. Just keep getting grants. That's the easiest way to maintain a competitive salary. So sorry, I didn't realize I had it where it would automatically turn. Next slide, please. So one of the things to be aware of is who's sitting at the table reviewing your grants. And I have served on student study sections, various study sections for over a decade, and I've chaired study sections. And overwhelmingly, there are PhDs around the table. So grants that are written and think like a PhD are more likely to be scored well than grants that think more like a clinician. And what I mean by that is, when you're in medical school, you're taught to think broad, think about all the possibilities, what could potentially present this way. And you're actually rewarded verbally and in other ways when you present broad differentials. So when a patient comes in, what is it most likely to be, and what are the other things it could be? And so when MDs write grants, they tend to write grants like that. You're thinking about all the different possibilities, and you're trying to be thorough. However, PhDs are actually thought to think deep. So take one target, and what is the molecular mechanism driving that target? And then can you, in the state of disease, block that and get rid of the disease? So if you're writing a grant as a medical doctor and you're writing about the different pathways, you name 3 different pathways that could be involved, then they think you lack focus, because PhDs actually want you to think about one pathway and what's the molecular basis for that pathway and trying to understand it. So really, a lot of the when I write grants now, so in my lab, I have PhDs more than MDs, because I need somebody who thinks very molecular in the lab. And when I write my grants, I try to write them like a PhD, because this is really important, because I realized that's who's around the table, PhDs. Next slide, please. And then, so early in your career, you should be focusing on K awards, and there's various types of K awards. There's so many different. There's K awards if you're interested in clinical sciences. There are K awards if you're interested in basic sciences. There's K awards that help you transition from being a postdoctoral fellow to an early career faculty member. We call those K99s R00s. So just knowing the type of K awards that are available, and you can look these up. You can look up NIH K awards, and they will explain what the different types of K awards are for, and you find the one that fits best for you. Next slide, please. And so one of the things to remember is for the NIH, this was in 2019. I did look up the data for 2020, and it was even less. So I was a little bit depressed. I was like, no, I can't present this data. So there's not a ton of NIH grants in sarcoidosis. And I think part of it is in our field, we lack an animal model. And in order for these PhDs to be impressed with what you're proposing, you have to do what they call in vivo confirmation. So in a mouse, in some sort of animal model, you have to demonstrate that this pathway is important, and that if you therapeutically target that pathway, you get rid of the phenotype. So so if you can see, if you look at other diseases like IPF, for example, you'll see triple the number of R01s, R21s, and F32s. So there definitely are people getting funding, particularly R01 funding. One of the things that I suggest now to early career faculty members is, if you're at a place where there's not a funded sarcoidosis researcher, you should consider finding a mentor who does have funding in a field that's of interest to you, and ask them, can you and they write a grant together, but you're going to focus on sarcoidosis. So what that does is, a lot in grant writing, they have something that says, he that has the gold gets more gold. And so I do see a study section that often people that are well funded continue to get more grants. So if you, at your particular institution, if there's not a sarcoidosis researcher who actually has funding, this would be a perfect time to find someone who's doing something that's of interest to you. You're not doing it just to try to get funding, but doing something that is of interest to you, and asking them, would you be interested in seeing if this pathway is important in sarcoidosis? For example, one of the basic immunologists at Vanderbilt has all these rodent models of different CD4 T cell subsets, which is what I'm interested in. And I said, well, would you be okay with us looking to see if these cells, can I use your mouse models to show if these cells are or aren't important in disease? And he was like, oh yeah, sure, knock yourself out. And I said, I'll need you to come in as a co-investigator, because they know I don't have these mice. He's like, oh yeah, sure, I'll do whatever will help you. So definitely pairing yourself with someone who is well-funded, but you're going to apply what they're doing to sarcoidosis, is one technique that's been successful in getting grant funding. Next slide, please. And there are not a ton of early stage investigators with K01 funding, so we really do want to encourage you to apply for K awards. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. Next slide. So there are two things you need in order to have a successful K award. So the first thing is papers. So I've reviewed numerous Ks. I mean, just a ton. In fact, they asked me to chair the K committee, but I was already chairing another study section. Papers matter, and papers that have you as first author matter. So study section members believe if you have a K, if you have papers that you're first author on, then you're more likely to write grants that will go and be funded. They're trying to see, is this a person that if we give them $500,000 over the course of 5 years, that they will be able to do the research and then translate that research into an R01. So one of the things we have at Vanderbilt is we have something called a Manuscript Sprint, where we actually teach early stage investigators how to write an introduction, How do you write a methods section? What should a results section look like? And these are things that are super helpful that you can actually, through curriculum, learn how to write. So that whether you stay at your home institution or you move to a different one, you actually have learned how to write. So papers is number one. Then number two is, and I wrote Manuscript Sprint, having a mentor that has had success in mentoring other mentees as well as getting funding themselves is also really important. So they want to know that even though they know you may not stay at your home institution, they want to know that if you choose to stay, the mentor that you selected has a track record for helping investigators get R01 funding. So that'll be super important. So, so this is something that I would encourage you to do, is make sure that you pick a mentor who's mentored other people to independent funding, at least a K. That helps a lot. Next one, please. Next slide. So when they're reviewing your K award productivity, so the number of papers you have, they think is really important. Your career development plan is really important. So what are you going to do to further develop yourself professionally so that you can be independent? Are you going to take a grant writing course? Are you going to learn a new skill set? Maybe you're going to get a master's in clinical investigation. What are the things you're going to do to aid your own independence? And then having a research plan that when they're reading the K award, they're saying, if this work gets completed, could they transition this to an R01? Definitely, if you have a mentor that's you love what you guys are proposing, you love this area of investigation, but they have not mentored anyone to a K, it's definitely permissible and even a good idea to have someone co-mentor you on your application. So for example, my very first postdoc, she was my first postdoc. So of course I had not mentored anybody to a K. And so I asked one of the more senior immunologists who did have a track record with mentoring early career faculty, would he serve as co-mentor on the award so that they wouldn't have, the reviewers would not have any concerns about independence. And they did, and it worked out really well. And then something for you to remember once you get your K is to volunteer to serve on the NIH study section. So they're often looking for early stage investigators that can serve on the study section, not permanently, but you're called an ad hoc member, so sort of like a guest study section member. The reason that's helpful is as you listen to the committee review R01 applications, then that teaches you what they emphasize. It teaches you what mistakes people make. It helps you understand what they consider a good grant or not a good grant. So all of these things are really important skill sets as you're applying for your K and then after you get your K. Next slide, please. Okay, and then if you're thinking about applying for a K, please make sure that you speak to your institution to see what type of support you have as you're writing your K. For example, at Vanderbilt, we actually have a library of all different types of awards, R01s, Euro awards, K24s, K awards, program projects. We have all these different, what they call a funded grants repository. And you literally can say, I'd like to see the last 4 successful K24 applications at Vanderbilt. And they'll send them to you and you can look and see, they'll send you the study section comments, what the study section liked about them, what they didn't like about them. Also at Vandy, something that we do, and not every institution has this, is we actually have a formal grant review called a studio before the grant is submitted. In fact, at Vanderbilt, you actually can, an early stage investigator cannot submit a career development award without undergoing this review. They actually can't. And so, but as a consequence of this, about 70% of our postdocs who apply for a K get it the first time. And then our K to R transition, so K awardees who are applying for Rs, about 70% of them actually get R01 funding. But not necessarily the first time, they may have to go back in, but they do transition. And it's because before their grant goes to the NIH, they've had an internal review, which really helps them to to know what common pitfalls, what's not clear. Did you see this mistake on page 7? Oh, you left out this section. Your preliminary data does not support your hypothesis. It's all things that are super helpful to present to the NIH the very strongest application. And then we also have something called grant pacing workshops. So early on, it's definitely a good idea to give yourself 6 months to write a grant. There's so many pieces to a grant that trying to do it under a short period of time is not optimal. So it's a really good idea to try your best to give yourself 6 months. And even with the grant pacing workshop, we have them create a timeline. I want to have a specific grants page written by hand. I'm going to have my bio sketch in. I'll have my letters of collaboration. I'll have my budget by this certain time. By the time you're at my stage of professor, you can write a grant. You can honestly write a grant in 6 weeks. And that may not be your best grant, but you can write a grant in 6 weeks. But that is not true when you're early stage, because there's just so many moving pieces, and trying to get all those pieces into one packet is a daunting task. Okay, next stage, sorry. So from the heart, lung, blood perspective, there are several components. So getting a successful application, they want something that is very basic. So even if you're doing clinical work, you need to propose to look at the driving your clinical phenotype. They love animal work because that gives them what they call in vivo confirmation. It's definitely not unreasonable to submit your grant early. So if it's due on May 3rd, it's definitely not unreasonable to submit it on May 1st, because sometimes as you're submitting the grant, there's a mistake in it. You wait to the last minute, you may not have time to correct the mistake. So we just submitted a grant that was due, I think, like February the 26th, and we started submitting it February the 22nd. That was a very large grant, but there was just so many pieces that we didn't want the machine to get overwhelmed. And then I just had a mentee not too long ago who was in Africa, instead trying to submit a grant to the NIH, and the internet broke down where she was, and she tried to submit it the day it was due, so it never got in. So all these little, what I call flukes, can happen. So it's definitely reasonable to give yourself 48 hours beforehand to submit your grant. Just tell yourself in your mind, it's due on this day, and then try to submit it. So if there is a mistake, you have time to fix it. One of the things they say is if you're going into a field that your mentor is not an expert in, to definitely bring a co-mentor on and kind of outline what role that will be. And I think that's a great idea. If you lack training in a particular area, it's definitely not wrong to say, as part of my professional development, I'm going to learn. Let's say you've been a molecular scientist, but now you're looking at immune cells, and you propose to do flow cytometry. Well, then you can say, I am going to take these courses in flow cytometry that are offered locally, that are offered nationally, like at an event called Fsr, F-O-C-I-S. And so you got a lot of different options. Just making sure that your data is, whatever you put is truthful. Some people don't mind stretching the truth, but there's nothing more embarrassing than to get an idea, and then it's nothing more embarrassing than people to find out that you didn't quite. And then talking to the program officer, I think it may or may not be helpful. It just depends on the program officer. There's some program officers that kind of lay it out beautifully and you understand what they want you to do. And then there's some that don't. And so you're just kind of stuck for a minute. Next slide, please. And then the other thing, so I'm just talking for the last 5 minutes on being creative and in applying. So for example, Doris Duke has a clinical scientist. So people, when they think of funding, they think about the NIH, and the NIH is phenomenal. The money is phenomenal. The opportunities are phenomenal. So all those things are great. But there's other sources of funding that should be tapped. And these other sources actually have a higher chance of you getting it funded. So for right now, like in lung diseases, your grant application has to score in the top like 10th percentile. Well, they say 18th percentile in order to get funded. However, if you apply for the Doris Duke Clinical Scientist Program, their percentile is in the top 30th, and anything in the top third. So it gives you another opportunity to in a space that isn't as competitive. It's very competitive. I review for them too, but the chances of getting it are higher because they are at the 30th percentile instead of the 18th. So they have a competition every year. It's 150,000 every year, plus they pay 10% in indirect costs. They usually fund somewhere around 20 applications every year, so it's very exciting. Now, Doris Duke, this is a funding mechanism based on the will of the billionaire Doris Duke, and she did not believe in animal research. So this is a funding mechanism for people who, like sarcoidosis researchers, that primarily do clinical research. So you might do population genetics or population epidemiology or translational research. Well, this is perfect for you. And they're disease agnostic. So they don't care if your disease is rare or common or anything. This is your chance to get funding. So I really want to encourage you to look at opportunities like the Doris. Next slide, please. And then this is just the announcements that come in every year. So typically the announcements go in the early summer, and then you receive notice if you've made the cut off or not. So they have you do a little 2-page preliminary, and then if that is screened positive, then you're invited to submit the full application. Next slide, please. There are other funding opportunities through the Ats Foundation. You know, I used to sit on the scientific review committee, and very few sarcoidosis grants come through, but shout out to OSU. They had a Parker B. Francis Award this year. Landon from the Ohio State University got a Parker B. Francis. So I would encourage you to kind of think about non-traditional research funding. Also for the ATS Mallinckrodt Award, definitely consider applying for it also. It's $40,000 over 2 years. Next slide, please. And then there are other opportunities like the L'Oreal USA for Women in Science. So this is $60,000 for research in any of the STEM-related fields. What I have found surprisingly is that applying for grants in non-traditional sites actually has more success than applying for grants in more traditional sites. It's sort of like a prophet having no honor in their own country. So definitely considering places like the L'Oreal USA for Women in Science, I think is a great idea. Next slide, please. Another mechanism that I really, really want the sarcoidosis field to think about is the Hannah Gray Fellowship. So the Howard Hughes Medical Institute supports about 20 scholars every year. They actually have one for scholars of diverse backgrounds. And this is amazing. So this is basically 8 years of funding. They'll support 4 years of graduate school and then 4 years of early career faculty. It equals $1.4 million. It's actually more money than the NIH equivalent award, which is the K99R00. And it's open to all fields of study. So typically, Hannah Gray Fellows apply after their first year of their postdoctoral fellowship. And so if you can hit the ground running, you have a lot of potential. There's an actual in-person interview. And I can tell you, these awards definitely distinguish the early career faculty members because it's so prestigious. And plus they have annual meetings where you meet with other Howard Hughes investigators. So it's definitely providing a wonderful opportunity to grow professionally. Next slide, please. And then this is the eligibility criteria. I don't need to discuss this. You can be MD or PhD. Next slide, please. Other considerations are the Veterans Administration Career Development Awards. The mentor has to be a mentor that has a VA Merit Award, which is the equivalent of an NIH R01. But it also pays very, very well and actually has more money than the NIH as far as research dollars awarded every year. This is a major career development award. It can be for clinical scientists, basic scientists, whatever you would like. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just their timeline, where there's basic sciences, clinical sciences, health sciences, or rehab sciences. Next slide, please. And then a well, I don't know if it's a well-known secret, but another source of funding is a site called Grantome, Grantome. And it's basically a database of all the grants that are available in the United States, everyone that has funding. The reason this is helpful is it gives you other ideas of how of other funding agencies. It can help you identify potential collaborators in the field. So if you're interested in sarcoid research, this is how you can find out pretty quickly who has funding, which institution they're at, and what is their area of focus. So when I put in sarcoidosis, it gave me about 5 pages of grants directly and indirectly related to sarcoidosis. Next slide, please. And as you can see, there's a ton of young people, early career awardees like K01s, K23s, R21s. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I want you to just don't be discouraged at all about getting grants in sarcoidosis. I totally believe that there's a mechanism to do it. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to email me. I'm more than happy to talk to you about some things. If some of what I said wasn't clear, but I gave you all my secrets. I didn't hold anything back. Ozzy will confirm it. One of the things to know is that innovation is key to getting grants and partnering with a successful investigator. Applying for grants other than the NIH is really important. Definitely taking advantage of FSR. Remember, if a grant gets rejected, you've gotten comments back, and read those comments. I mean, it hurts when you first get it because you've worked so hard, but read those comments, use them to further strengthen your grant, and then apply for another grant. I've had grants that have gotten rejected and they liked a particular section a lot. I just literally cut and paste that section and apply for it, use that section to apply for another smaller grant, and it got funded right away. So you are not wasting time when you're applying for grants. Don't be surprised if they don't get funded. Use it as an opportunity to learn. And then make sure that you look at all these different mechanisms like L'Oreal Women in Science and the Howard Hughes Hannah Gray Fellowship and the Doris Duke. I mean, it's just all these different opportunities outside of the NIH to apply for funding. And honestly, once you start getting funding from those mechanisms, you can apply for NIH funding and it actually gets easier. So apply early, apply often. If your institution can do an internal grant review, I think that's super helpful. And whatever you do, don't give up. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Ozzy.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to talk a little bit more about, I've been asked to speak about my experience as an early career professional trying to transition to a faculty position, and also to give some tips from the perspective of a trainee, a young investigator trying to break into this whole cult of grant recipients, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that I faced as an early career professional trying to become independent. And I guess 5 tips that I have gotten away with just watching Dr. Drake write grants, having written 2 grants as well, things that actually stand out to me. Next slide, please. Okay, so yes, so I'm going to be talking about 5 tips for early career investigators. Please go to the next slide. And really 3 things. I'm going to talk about some barriers that I faced as an early investigator, give you my 5 tips, and of course, give you a little bit of resources that I'm trying not to repeat anything that Dr. Drake has already said because she was really in-depth in the things that she spoke about. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the very first thing that I faced as an early investigator was immigration and visa restrictions. So a lot of people don't know this, but there are times when, if you look at most of the NIH announcements, you see that most of these grants are for permanent residents or for citizens. And so there are a lot of brilliant investigators who really want to do the work, right? They want to do the research, but they can't because they have visa restrictions. So I was recently on a podcast. It's called the Sarcoidosis podcast with John Carling. And one of the things that he asked me was, what can we do to encourage more people to be in this field? Because currently not a lot of investigators working on sarcoidosis. And these are some of the reasons, people don't know about the disease, or they have these restrictions that don't allow them to apply or even go ahead with their career. Please, next slide. So one of the things that I found out just trying to, once I had decided that I really wanted to stay in this field, I really wanted to research, I found out that you can actually apply for a green card on the basis of the work that you do. So a lot of you are already doing important work that is beneficial to the United States. And based on that, you can apply for a green card. Now, you don't need an employment offer. You don't need a sponsor. You can do that all by yourself. And so that's something that I actually want you guys to know about. Next slide. So basically what the immigration law states is that you have to have exceptional abilities and that you're doing something that is in the national interest of the United States. And if that is the case, and we're doing sarcoidosis research, this is important because a lot of people in the United States actually have this disease or suffer from this disease. And so that's really important. And this is really crucial because once you get over this barrier, you're then able to go ahead and apply for grants that have that restriction, if that is something that you're facing. Next slide. The next thing that I would say that I saw as a barrier, of course, is work-life imbalance. So there are times when you have to actually find a balance. So I've read so many articles, I've gone to so many seminars, and I always ask the same questions, like, how can I do the work but still maintain balance, right? And just reading the articles, I find that a lot of women, right after they have their families and they have their kids, just coming back to work, they experience that transition. They feel like they've been gone for too long. And I feel like this is me right now because I just had a baby and I'm trying to transition back to work and, I'm trying to find a balance. So just doing the research, I find that if you can delegate as much as possible, if you can find help, but you really delegating the little things that you really don't have to be involved in, I feel like that would really, really help. Next slide. So those are the two that really affect me. But there are other things that I find that, are barriers to people who are trying to transition to a early career faculty position or, start their career. Inadequate research funds, lack of access to quality training opportunities, lack of research positions, lack of good mentorship. Now, fortunately, these are not the things that directly affect me because I was fortunate enough to find myself in a research intensive institution, have a good mentor, and so I have access to some of these things. But if you find that these are some of the things that you or someone is actually going through, some of the solutions for lack of quality training opportunities, lack of research position, lack of, if you find a really good mentor, you'll find that you wouldn't have a problem with most of these things. For work-life balance, some people have suggested getting something else that you do outside work so that you can get rejuvenated when your grants don't get accepted first try, and then come back, fully prepared to face the work. And so if you find that Dr. Jerick has outlined a lot of brilliant things about how you can write a great grant, but if you don't go back and really look at those sections, you're really not going to be successful. So if you can take online courses about grant writing, if you have access to in your institutions to successful grants that people have written, these are things that would really, really help you strengthen your application. Next slide, please. And so the tips that I have 5 tips. The first one is get a mentor. I absolutely think that you need a mentor. You need someone to show you the ropes, someone who's done it before, so you're not reinventing the wheel and wasting a lot of time. Next slide. And when I think about a mentor, one of the things that I guess Tamara talked to me about was discussing how I found Dr. Drake, some of the attributes that she has that I feel are helpful to me. And I've kind of, categorized it in 3 different broad groups. First, your mentor has to be knowledgeable. They have to really know the science. That way they can train you and help you improve. So if you're looking at an aspect of sarcoid that you really want to go and you really want to find someone who knows a lot about that area. The next thing I'll say is they have to be leaders in the field because you need the connections. You need someone who will inform you if there are opportunities that you don't know about, if there are awards that you need to apply for. These things look good on your application. someone needs to look out for you. And so find a mentor who will inspire you to succeed, and of course, who will give you the connections that you need. There are a lot of times when we've tried something in the lab that hasn't worked, and Dr. Drake picks up the phone and calls someone who she knows who's doing something similar, and she just, asks for help. And I've seen her do that a lot of times because she has those connections. And so I think it's really important to find people that, be the bridge between you and the resources that you need. And the third thing I'll say is find someone who really wants to see you grow, someone who's excited about your next step as you are, because that would make a really big difference in just how much they're able to help you move to the next step. All right, next slide, please. Okay, and then the second tip, so the first one is find a good mentor. The second tip is you need preliminary data. So I've read a lot of grants announcements that say you don't really need any data, you can apply, but remember that your competition has data. So if they have 10 people vying for the same spot and someone has preliminary data, they've shown that they can do the work. So if you have data, it's very advisable to put that data in because your competition is going to do that. Next slide. Thank you. The third one I'll say is time. So you really need the time. You need to set a realistic timeline. Dr. Drake has said 6 months, but you really need ample time to put together a great application. Next slide. And the reason why you need a really good timeline is because you want to be able to come up with your preliminary data. You want to be able to ask the right questions. You need to ask for help. You can't, keep going on forever writing your application. There's a deadline. And in order to meet that deadline, you need to set a realistic timeline, right? What do you want to do with your proposal? Another thing I'll say is you really need to read the instructions. So I feel like I have a personal experience there. When I was writing my K award, I read the instructions. I got all this numerous advice from people. We even have a grants office that helps you actually put in the grant application. So you can just focus on the science. So they will help you turn the application in. When it was time to turn the application in, I had everything that needed to go in the application there. However, I turned in the recommendation letters with the actual application. Now, they had written in the instructions that you needed to turn it in a separate way. And because of that, I had to wait for a totally different cycle. So you see things like that happen where someone is giving you advice. That's great, but you really need to read the instructions. Even if you have a grants office that's doing most of the submitting for you, and read the instructions is really important. And then the last thing I'll say is please ask for help. You need help, right? Someone called me, I think last week, I said, I really need a little favor, right? But to me, it doesn't really mean, I don't see it as a little favor or a big favor. If help is help, right? So ask for help early. You may need help with people editing your grant proposal. You may need help with a professional editor. I always say that. I remember saying that to someone that, have you thought about having someone professionally just go through your manuscript? And she said to me, I have a PhD, I don't need an editor. That's great. You have a PhD, but it might not be a PhD in English, or you just don't have the time. A lot of times you're writing things in a short period. Because you're really, really looking at those things, you're not realizing what the errors are. And so you might need an extra pair of eyes to just go through stuff and show you the errors that you're not seeing. Next slide, please. Okay, so I was saying that you need time because you actually need to do the experiments. And of course, you need to go through the grant itself with a fine-tooth comb, right? So great ideas still will not get funded if you don't present them in the best way, right? People have really amazing ideas, but because they haven't taken the time to go through those, take those errors out, those errors are actually really distracting when you try to turn your grant in. Next slide, please. The fourth tip I'd say is you really need experts to weigh in. So Vanderbilt is a great institution because it's a research-intensive institution. You have people who are really successful here at Vanderbilt who've done this grant writing, they've got multiple grants, and they have different expertise that they can bring to the table. So if you have a grant that you're writing, don't write your grant in secret. Like, I know there's competition, there's a politics of running a lab and having, all that stuff. But you can find people who you trust who can actually weigh in and tell you what they feel about your grant. For instance, your idea might be overambitious. So you might be proposing to do something, but you need to take a lot of baby steps before you get there. Those experts will actually let you know the things that you need to do to get that grant funded, right? The important question is, can this be done in the time frame that you're trying to do it? Some things cannot be done in a flash. Some things need to, take time to do, and those experts will actually let you know. Sometimes our ideas are not realistic. In the grand scheme of things, yes, it's a great idea. You want to cure sarcoid, but the way that you're going about it might not be realistic, and your experts will tell you about that. And then you have to ask, do the right experiments to answer the questions that you're asking in your grant. These experts will actually weigh in to let you know the best ways that you can do things, get things done in the time frame that you have to work with. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of the resources that we have here at Vanderbilt, Dr. Drake has spoken a lot about the studio sessions that you have, the Manuscript Sprint, where we write manuscripts, and there's a designated group that helps us just go through the manuscript and things like that. But I'll talk about 4 things. So the first is you have to take grant writing courses. So it's not enough to come to these sessions and take notes. I'm really good at taking notes at things like this, but then I may go home and never use those notes. You actually have to consciously take these notes that we're giving and actually do things with them. So for instance, if you need to take a grant writing course, there are lots of virtual courses online that can help you. People who've been successful, they'll give you tips about how to actually get things done. So webinars, breakout sessions at conferences, things like this Zoom call that we're having right now. These are really helpful, and they'll help you write a really successful grant. The next thing is grant studio sessions. So when I wrote my K, I just wrote a K grant, and we were able to set up a studio session where we had experts actually weigh in and critique our work, constructive criticism. They give their views on what could make the grant stronger, some of the pitfalls in the grant that I didn't even know about. They were really helpful. And I feel like if you have access to these kind of mechanisms in your institutions, you definitely should take advantage of this. Now, if you don't have access to it, you can actually set up your own studio by reaching out to those people who you feel would be able to critique your grant and give you the guidance that you need. I always talk about editors. Like I talk about this a lot because there are a lot of things that you need to do to get a grant going, papers that you need to write. A lot of times you send in your manuscript and they're telling you that there are lots of errors that you didn't even pick up yourself because you're trying so hard to meet a deadline. I'm such an advocate for having someone else look over your manuscript. It could even be a grad student, someone who is really good at telling stories. So some people are great at science, but they're not really great at presenting the science or even writing about it. And there are people who are just gifted. They're great storytellers. They can keep you intrigued by just the words that they use. And so you can find these people around you and actually engage them and have them do some of the heavy lifting for you. And then you can find a mentoring committee. So this is actually great. Dr. Drake talked about it. I have a mentoring committee for my K grant, and I'm interested in looking at the microbiome. So we have a microbiome specialist on there. We have someone who's, with immunology, different people who actually have the expertise that would actually be beneficial to the grant, right? They actually are on this committee. Now, I guess Tamara was expecting me to, I guess there's no magic way that I found a Dr. Drake, right? Sometimes you'll get lucky and you meet a good mentor, but if you haven't found one, or if you're with a mentor that you're not quite sure that you're getting your needs met, or vice versa, I don't know how it works. One of the things that you can do is you can actually reach out to other people and form a committee, right, of people who you feel would be really great assets to the grant that you're trying to write. One of the things that they can also do for you, they can help you with your career trajectory. They can actually give you advice on how to move to the next step, smoothly move to the next step, because they've been there. You really don't have to reinvent the wheel at all. Next slide, please. And finally, my last tip is be optimistic. There'll be more opportunities. A lot of times we're all competing for 2 slots, or we're all competing for 4 slots, or there's not a lot of slots available for all these brilliant ideas at the same time. The first time I applied for a grant, I didn't get a good message back. And I remember going home and it ruined my entire day. But I learned over time that it gets better. If you don't get funded today, you get another opportunity tomorrow. And so that's something that I want to leave you with, is be optimistic. It does get better. It's not about you personally. You don't have to take it personal, but just find ways to tweak your grants. If you get critique that it's not going to be funded right now, but implement those changes and then apply for more grants. Next slide, please. And then in terms of where you're going to apply for grants, the NIH is a great place, especially for people like me who are looking to really be independent, start my own independent research, and just establish that as a career path in this field. But there are also foundations like, FSR, Foundation of Sarcoidosis Research, IPF also has something similar. You can actually look at these as well. I know in the field, people look at the NIH as, if you have an NIH grant, they look at it as, the ultimate grant. But having all these other foundations, having these grants being funded by all these foundations, it actually makes you even look better when you apply to the NIH if that's what you want to do. Sometimes your institutions also have grants that you can actually look into. So they have T32 grants, they have K-12 grants that might be beneficial to you as well. So you might want to actually look within your institution to see if there are opportunities that they have locally that would really help you, right? So that's really all that I have. If you have any questions, you want to reach out to me in the future, my details are on the next slide. Yes, thank you so much.
So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We do have a couple of questions already. Dr. Drake, in your opinion, what is the most effective aspect, what's the most important aspect of an effective grant proposal?
Probably the most effective aspect. A lot of people grants don't get funded because of what they call the approach, how people are just proposing to do the experiment. So you have to be really careful and just make sure that, as Ozzy mentioned, the experiments that you're proposing will address the hypothesis. It's work that can actually be done. It's something that you haven't ever done. If it's something you have done, cite the publications where you've done that work, and so that they'll know that this isn't new to you. If it's something you haven't done, and you can say, I've brought in Dr. So-and-so, who's the world's expert in single cell sequencing,
Thank you. Dr. Azioma, I know that you did a fellowship grant. So one of the questions is, how much time do you dedicate to research versus clinical? Do you do any clinical work?
No, I don't do any clinical work. So I'm actually on the PhD side, the scientist track, and so not on the clinical side. So I dedicate a lot of time, almost all the time that I have, to just doing the research.
Also, can you speak about, to both of you, since you both had previous grants, can you speak about the reporting experience that you both have had with FSR and the NIH?
Yeah, FSR's reporting structure is much easier. The NIH is pretty easy too. They lay it out well. And if you're writing papers, it's really easy because you can just cut and paste from your papers because you have to give a scientific progress. I think FSR's is super easy to their reporting structure.
Yes. So with FSR, which is what I have experience with, they require that we give an update on our progress every 6 months. So when we get the grant, we actually sign that we're actually going to update them with the progress of papers. If we're going to conferences, publication, any awards that we've gotten, things like that, just to show that we've been productive with the grants that they're giving out. And so that's something that I really appreciate, because that also helps you keep track of the timeline and also the progress that you're making, or not making. But yeah, FSR is really good at asking for those updates. And so I really appreciate that they did that.
One last question before we'll close up, since we're going a little over. I think this one's pretty important. So given the limited funding, how do you best utilize funding, the best way to utilize a small amount of funding? I'll let either one of you, since you both have experience with
this. Hopefully you're designing experiments that will ask further questions. So when you're thinking about your project, you want to make sure that you actually plan how you're going to do your project, that you think about how much it's going to cost. When you interpret the data, you're thinking about what is the next step, because that's what the grants are. It's just leading it from one step to the next.
I think also collaborations is actually great. Not people who are actually going to ask for effort, right, on the grants, but people who are really interested in just getting more publications, getting really interested in the science, and not, you explain to them that I don't have a lot of funding, but I really need your expertise. Would you be interested in working on this project in exchange for probably being on the manuscript as well? And what that brings to the table is that they also bring their expertise, and then the work pretty much moves forward with the little funds or the little funding that you have.
All right. Thank you both so much, Dr. Drake and Dr. Kioma. I really appreciate your time and your presentation. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us for today's webinar. If you are interested in learning more about FSR's programming, such as this webinar series, and wish to receive research updates and information on funding opportunities, please visit our Join Our Physician Community tab on our website, which is www.sarcoidosis.org. Go to Join Our Physician Community. And as a reminder, our FSR Small Grant applications are due May 31st at 11:59 p.m. Central Time. So to learn more about that, also go to our website, or you can email me. My phone number or my email is Tamara, Tamara, @stopsarcoidosis.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today and for all the great advice and tips. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you, everyone. Bye.